Hi everyone, today I'm going to paint this tiny little shell that I picked up on the beach. And the drawing will be very simple, just a rounded shape on some of my sketchbook paper. It's not very expensive paper, but it's reasonable paper and I like to do my little studies on this type of paper. And I normally say use a good quality paper, and this is a good enough quality paper for my sketches. I love Fabriano and Art's watercolor, hot press watercolor paper or cold press watercolor paper, but this is a mixed media paper and is perfect for these studies. All the colors I used some ultramarine, quinacridone rose, some yellow, and Payne's gray. These are the only colors that I use for these little shell paintings. And then I use a brush with a nice tip. So anything with a nice tip, small enough, maybe a 4 or 5 will be perfectly fine for this. And I use my patty eraser just to soften the little pencil markings. I will leave them dark enough. This is the mixed media paper that I spoke about. Fun, it's really fun paper or nice paper to use for these little fun studies. And this is the tiny little shell that I will be painting. So I'm going to start with some of this Payne's grain mix. It's not too watery, just enough water on the palette so that I can paint it on the little top part of the shell. I'm going to take it right down on the sides there, and then I'm going to go around this section because it's a white surface that I'm painting on. I want the shell to show, so I'm going to take this very watery mix all over the outside of this shell painting. And then I leave it for a second to dry completely. I need some tissue paper, so just hang on a sec. Just going to put it underneath my palette here, right next to me. I can dab my brush on there. So I do have clean water. I have my porcelain plate next to me with all of my mixed colors. I hope it's bright enough. I have to move in front of the window to use the natural light as use of the light, and I can't use my light I normally use. I do hope it's bright enough. So this is the color that I'm looking for. I'm going to use some quinacridone rose, some yellow. So you can use nickel azo yellow, any nice bright yellow. Do mix this separately on your paper to see if it works for you. And I'm going to start to paint the little details on the center or the side of the shell and in the middle of the shell. So I want to get a nice dark purple mix. This might be a bit too blue, but I can always adjust it later with just a bit of pink, extra pink on there. And again, a brush with a nice tip is what I use for these little tiny little details. And I make sure that I leave parts of the paper open. So I don't want to paint absolutely everywhere. So the minute you wet your paper, all the pigment will flow wherever your paper is wet. So just remember with watercolors, wherever you wet a section and you put the dark pigment down, the paper will be flooded with that dark pigment. And you have to maybe control with a bit more water. You'll see later on how I pick it up. So for this, I just soften all of those little lines with very little water on my brush. So if you are worried that you have too much water on your brush, just dab your brush on your tissue paper right next to you and then remove the excess water. And this is exactly what I do because I do not want it to flood this whole little shelf because then I will ruin it. However, I can quickly pick it up with some clean water and my brush if I dab it on the tissue paper right next to me. Now I'm going to make those little markings that I can see on the little shell. My shell, I will have to use a little bit of, say for instance, Payne's grey or this purple mix just to darken the inside to make it look a little bit more 3D like I did on this little shell painting on the left hand side. I want to create those markings that I can see on the inside of the shells. I just dab my brush on those little sections there and soft little markings with the tip of my brush. I'm very careful here not to flood the paper with any of this purple mix because I do want to leave those little light parts as light as possible that I have on the paper on the right hand side. So very clean water on my brush and then I just smooth those little lines, all those little hard lines that I painted with a clean wash. It's a bit of a water glaze that I'm adding in there. Now, very watery mix here. You'll see I have a lot of the Payne's Grey mix on my brush right now, but I'm going to show you how I quickly dab it and remove it. So this will just stain the paper. So I will take my brush, dip it in clean water, dip it on the tissue paper, and just remove the excess. But you can see already how it's stained the paper, and that is exactly what I wanted. So again, I just dab my brush on the parts here on the little shell, and then I lift it out. So I use my brush as the eraser or as a little mop. You can even use some tissue paper just to remove the excess. That is exactly what I want, and then I just use my brush to soften all of those little hard lines. Some more of that darker Payne's Grey, purple mix, and I'm smoothing the little lines now. So I just use my brush softly over these little sections. And now I want to start darkening those little center parts. But I'm first going to paint a little shadow. This will help to make the shells stand out on the paper because it is watercolor paper and it is white. I need something to make the shell pop off the paper, and this normally helps. So I just wet my paper and in a very watery mix. I'm going to get some more of that Payne's Grey mix. This looks very, very dark. Don't get a fright. I will show you exactly what I'm going to do now. A bit too much pigment for someone if you are a beginner and you're scared. So don't pick up too much pigment, but I will show you exactly how I remove that, but it will already again stain the paper. And I make sure that I have my clean water next to me and I just lift it out very quickly. It's very hot and humid, so it takes a while to dry. And I just smooth it out and I push it against the edge of this shell. Just like this. You can still remove quite a bit of pigment. And I just wiggle my brush like I would a eradicator brush or a scrubber brush to remove that little hard line that I dropped in there. I do want it to show on the paper, so I want a bit more of a darker mix. And then I drop it in on the paper again, going against the shell there, right next to it. And I just dab my brush so that the pigment just go onto that paper. I'm going to leave that to disperse a little bit and do its thing, and then I will soften it a bit later again if I have to, if I'm not happy with that. Now I'm holding my brush at an angle and I'm pushing it towards the edge of that little shell section there. And this will help to create that dark little line. So I'm manipulating the pigment with my brush right now. And then I'm just going to go around the edges there to create that little section that I can see on the shell where the two little mushroom shells were connected and actually like a one solid little closed shell. And I'm trying to paint that in and I'm just darkening the little markings that I can see again. Again, softening those little lines that I painted earlier. And then I drop in some more pigment. But I make sure that the center of the shell is completely dry now, because if that is wet, all this pigment will flow into that part of the shell and this dark grey mix will just flood the whole little shell, and I don't want that. And already you can see it looks like a tiny, tiny little shell. Well, to me it looks like a tiny little shell. So I mix a bit of that yellow mix in there just to create that brown color and just to warm it up slightly. And then again I use my brush just to pick up the excess pigment, sweeping it against the edge there, lifting out some of the excess, softening those little lines. And I'm very happy with the final results. I hope you will join me again for some more of these shell tutorials. So don't forget to subscribe and press the bell button so that you will be notified every time I upload a video.